we probably shouldn't be eating even one. And so that's a threat signal to the body. We've got sleep deprivation, we've got chronic low grade stress, we're not moving our bodies a lot. All of these things translate into this reality in our body of, what's going on? There's some problem here. It's not normal. And that can bring.
Dr. Casey Means, I am just delighted to welcome you to the Better with Dr. Stephanie podcast. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
I was just enjoying our pre-chat so much that I figured that we might as well get started and get some of this juicy stuff in the conversation itself, because we were just talking about glucose and CGMs and all of that good stuff. And that's what we're going to be talking about today with my audience, my Betties. We are going to be talking about what a continuous glucose monitoring is, what the predictive value of it is, what it can tell us about our health. But before we get into glucose and insulin and all the metabolic juiciness, I wanted to start off by getting to know you a little better, because in doing my research, as I was saying to you in the pre-chat, in doing my research on you, very prestigious. Graduated from very prestigious school, doing surgery, head and neck. And then you find yourself a surgeon finds herself in being a metabolic health expert and a co-founder of a CGM company. So I would just love for you to lay the groundwork, give us a little history in terms of how you came to understand and to pursue what you now know, which is metabolic health and excellence.
Sure, absolutely. So I had kind of a circuitous route to being a health tech entrepreneur and really focusing on metabolic health. As you mentioned, I started in surgery. I trained at Stanford, and then I did a head and neck surgery residency. And in my training, I was treating a lot of conditions that are fundamentally inflammatory in nature. So things like sinusitis, thyroiditis, laryngitis, and all these itises. That's the suffix in medicine that means inflammation. So a lot of these inflammatory disorders. And how we conventionally treat these is often we'll give antibiotics, but it's a lot of steroids, and steroids are medications that really tamp down the immune system. And it's incredible how many steroids we use. We can give them orally, IV, inhaled, topical. There's just so many ways to settle down the immune system. And then when those ultimately fail, we often go to the operating room and we do something highly morbid. We cut into someone's body, and it's often to suck out like pus, inflammatory infiltrate, and things like that, and kind of change the plumbing. But what struck me is that none of what we were doing with the drugs or with the surgery was actually getting at the fundamental problem of what is causing inflammation. What is the trigger? Why are people's immune systems on high alert? Inflammation is ultimately a way the body's responding to a perceived threat. So what is that threat? And furthermore, why in our modern, Western medical system are the majority of conditions that we're facing, aside from just the head and neck, the ear, nose, and throat, also inflammatory in nature? So we now know that obesity, diabetes, even dementia, heart disease, these are also conditions where there's this inflammation. So really got me to step back and say, like, what's going on here? What's this trigger? And we know that our modern lifestyle is a huge trigger of inflammation. Almost everything we're doing in the lifestyle and dietary realm can be sort of considered this unnatural threat to the body, from the industrial hyper-processed foods that we're eating, these sort of Franken foods that our body has no idea what to do with, the massive amounts of sugar in our diet that our bodies were never meant to be exposed to. We're eating about 152 pounds of sugar, refined sugar, per person per year. We probably shouldn't be eating even one. And so that's a threat signal to the body. We've got sleep deprivation, we've got chronic low grade stress, we're not moving our bodies a lot. All of these things translate into this reality in our body of, what's going on? There's some problem here. It's not normal. And that can breed inflammation. So that was kind of an interesting process for me to say, why are we just going to the end of the line with these really morbid, intensive interventions when we could maybe be intervening earlier? And I became really focused on that sugar piece, because high blood sugar or eating sugar is a key driver of chronic inflammation in the body. And it's something we have a lot of control over. And I think something that has become so normalized in our culture that we don't even realize that it's in everything. There's like 250 names for sugar in the food that we're eating. And there's a lot of misinformation out there about whether it's okay to be eating and what it's actually doing to our bodies. And so became really focused on, how do we help people make better choices around this to ultimately hopefully create conditions in the body that are healthier and that are better. So that was a big part of it. And the second part was really just this kind of wake up call I had about 5 years into my surgical training, where I was kind of looking at the epidemiology of American health. And I was realizing, okay, we're spending $4 trillion on healthcare costs in the United States per year, more than any other country in the world by a huge margin. And our life expectancy is going down. And we are, by all accounts, as a population, getting sicker, fatter, and more depressed. Those three things are facts. So something is not working. We're paying more every year, we're doing worse, and we're actually getting worse year by year. If as a doctor, how could you not step back and say, what is wrong here? And it's really hard to move forward when you've kind of made that connection and need to just step back and focus on the systems issues. And the reality is that health does not come from a medication. Health does not even come from a doctor's visit. Health comes from the hundreds of micro decisions we make every single day. That's how you generate health. That's how you build a body. That's how you create cellular function that ultimately leads to health. And so that's the core issue in why we're failing as an American healthcare system, is because we don't focus at all on making the smart, personalized daily decisions that build health. We focus a lot on the reactive, treatment, going to the doctor's office, getting a pill, getting a surgery, none of which actually breeds health. It manages disease. So long story short, my core focus became, how, as a medical community, as a physician, do I empower individuals with the information they need to make smart, personalized, sustainable decisions day in and day out about the lifestyle and dietary factors that do generate health? And that's where Levels, my company, emerged from, which is this system that allows people to know exactly how every bite they're taking is affecting their blood sugar levels in real time, and then helps you move towards understanding how to improve that response. So we want glucose, blood sugar, to be more stable and gently rolling throughout the day. We don't want huge spikes and dips. And so for the first time, we have the power to see that in real time with what we're eating, and then learn to make choices that keep the blood sugar more stable. So that's sort of the past 10 years of my life in a nutshell.
I have to say that your conclusion is a profound one, because my training, I'm trained as a chiropractor. So we are considered generally as alternative healthcare providers, but we get, like, nutrition is part of the core curriculum in terms of, so we have always, the word health nut, I was told, I don't know if this is true or not, but the word health nut comes from sort of other, people calling chiropractors health nuts because we were talking about this crazy thing called nutrition. And when we look at, the curriculum, and this was, we were talking about Dr. Robert Lustig in the pre-chat, when we look at the curriculum of medical doctors, they don't get a lot of nutrition. There is this dogmatic paradigm where they are taught that the intervention, like the surgery or the medicine, is going to fix them. And I think that what you said around going to the doctor or, getting the prescription is not healthcare promotion. It's not health promotion. And it's a way to manage symptoms, perhaps, or it's a way to delegate your health to another person or system. And I think that, in order for you, a surgeon, so you've not just done, a medical degree, you've gone on to do residency and specialized training, to come to that kind of conclusion in the face of very much consensus medicine to the exact opposite, is quite incredible. And I just want to make sure that we honor that, because, sometimes, I think as naturopaths and osteopaths and we're like, God, is no one else seeing this? And then there's, knights in like yourself in shining armor, if you will, they're like, oh my gosh, someone else who agrees with us. This is so wonderful. So I think that that's really, really awesome.
Thank you. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. Yeah. I blame all the the incredible physician authors who, write all these books that we love. Like we were just talking about Robert Lustig, who wrote Metabolical and Hacking the American Mind, and Fat Chance, and people like Mark Hyman, who's written 14 books, and Sarah Gottfried, and Ben Bickman, and all these people who stepped back, looked at things critically, and then wrote about it. And I had those little earbuds and I was listening to those when I was in residency, and slowly but surely you kind of wake up to exactly what you're talking about, that we're not actually promoting health. we're just managing disease. And that's a big problem. And we are incentivized to treat disease, not to promote health. And so I'm just so grateful for the people who have, come before all of, and just like put this down on paper, because it really makes the difference. Once you hear that stuff, it's hard to unhear it. And it's hard to keep going to work every day doing the same thing. So I'm just eternally indebted to that, those people.
So let's talk a little bit about what continuous glucose monitoring is, because we're going to have a discussion around glucose today. We're going to have a discussion around insulin, and of course, in the course of this conversation, we might abbreviate. We might say something like CGM. So I want to make sure that my Betties know what CGM is, continuous glucose monitoring, what it is essentially doing, and talk a little bit about levels and how and what the company is doing around glucose monitoring.
Fantastic. Yeah. So maybe starting with some definitions.
Yeah, let's start with some definitions. Yeah.
Perfect. So CGM is a continuous glucose monitor. So this is a small wearable device that's the size of 2 quarters stacked on top of each other. And you actually stick it on the back of your arm, and it's got a tiny little 4 millimeter probe that goes under the skin, and it's measuring your blood sugar levels 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And you stick this little sensor on for 2 weeks. And every 15 minutes, it's actually just doing this little lab test under the skin and determining your glucose levels and sending that information to your smartphone for you to get that. So previously, people were pricking their fingers and getting a drop of blood and using that to kind of get a single time point measurement of blood sugar. But that's sort of like the photograph version of the data. This is the movie version. This is, all day you can actually see how things are rising in response to food, how things are rising in response to stress, and start making those insights about, when I had this high carb meal all by itself, I had a really big glucose elevation. But when I put it with some fat and protein and fiber, it was actually a lot more stable. Maybe I should do that more moving forward. So that's what CGM is. And probably a term we're going to be saying a lot during this episode, but happy to jump into, more about continuous glucose monitoring or wherever you'd like to go.
Yeah, I think that that's a great starting point, and we can get into what glucose is now, because once we understand CGM and what it's doing, of course, now the next logical place for that is, okay, so continuous glucose monitoring. Why do I care about glucose? And, if you've listened to previous podcasts, glucose is the molecule of life, right? It is the primary substrate for every single cell in our body. Of course, we've talked about alternate fuels like ketone bodies and things like that, but every single cell in the body has either the ability to use glucose, and there's some really special organs that make it. So let's talk to me about the chain of events, or maybe just the mechanistic chain of events that happens when we ingest a carbohydrate, and to some extent protein as well. We know that when we have protein, there's a bit of an insulinergic spike. But what happens when we eat these, exogenous dietary foods, and then what happens in terms of what are some of the hormones that are released? What happens in the body, and what are some of and maybe you can tie into that, and maybe this is the second question, but what are some of the averages or the ranges that you would like to see those hormones and those glucose levels fall in between?
Yes. So basically, when you eat dietary carbohydrates, you digest them, and they ultimately are going to break down into glucose in the bloodstream. And glucose goes into the bloodstream, and then the body basically responds by releasing this hormone called insulin, one of the most important hormones in the body that really is relevant to every single person, no matter what their health goals are. It's an incredible hormone. Almost every single cell in the entire body, 30 trillion of them, have insulin receptors. So it has a lot of functions. And the purpose of insulin is to help cells take up that glucose. And what glucose is, what this blood sugar is it's the fundamental metabolic substrate in our body. And what that means is that it is a substrate that can be transformed into energy in our cells that we can actually use to power our cells. The key thing about metabolism is that every single one of our 30 trillion cells in the body, and that's just human cells. We have about, I think 100 trillion bacterial cells in our body, but human cells. So this is the fundamental thing about metabolism. every single one of those 30 trillion cells needs energy to function, to do anything, to live, to do any of the functions they're supposed to do. If it's a brain cell, it needs energy to do brain stuff. If it's an ovary cell, it needs energy to do ovary stuff. But you can't just use the glucose. You have to convert it to energy that we can use, a currency we can use, which is generally called ATP. So glucose has to get into the cell, be converted to something that is a currency we can use. And when that process is going well and is efficient, and we're converting glucose properly to energy that we can use, and there's not a ton of excess, we're not creating harmful byproducts, that's a well-functioning metabolism. Our cells are functioning properly. When this process is not working well and we can't get the energy we need in the cells properly, or we're gumming up the cells with this excess byproduct of energy creation, we get dysfunction. We get cellular dysfunction. The cells don't work properly. And when cells don't work properly, tissues don't work properly, organs don't work properly, that's where symptoms arise. And so the reason that blood sugar and problems with blood sugar and problems with metabolism underlie almost every chronic condition we're seeing in our country, literally the 9 of the 10 leading causes of death in the United States are related to dysfunctional blood sugar in some way, is because this is a core pathway. It's a pathway relevant to every cell type. And really where this problem, this fundamental core problem is showing up is where symptoms, might emerge. If it's happening again in the ovary, it might look like polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is the leading cause of infertility in the United States, which is fundamentally a glucose problem in the ovary. If it's happening in the brain, it might look like dementia. If it's happening in the heart, it might look like heart disease. So how do we get those problems? Well, this is the interesting thing. When we eat too much glucose, day in and day out, we're constantly sort of spiking our glucose because we're eating too many dietary carbohydrates. The body's tasked with producing tons and tons of insulin to get all that glucose out of the bloodstream into the cells. And what happens over time is that the cells get overwhelmed. They can't process all this glucose. And so the cells actually say, stop, like, I don't want to get more of this into the cell. So the cells become resistant to that insulin signal. So now the bodies actually have to push out more insulin to try and drive that glucose into the cells. And this is where the wheels start coming off the bus and things are problematic. Now you've got this block to insulin. Glucose can't get into the cells as efficiently. Glucose starts to rise in the blood. And that whole energy process, it's like there's too much of this energy substrate, but we're not using it properly. And that's a real problem. This is where metabolic dysfunction starts arising. And this is really the path towards diabetes and these other related conditions. The interesting thing is, for many people, weight is an issue. And we've got 72% of Americans who are overweight and obese. Well, a really interesting thing about insulin is that aside from its function of essentially pulling glucose out of the bloodstream into the cells, its other function is to tell the body not to burn fat for energy, because fat is the other way that we can generate energy in the body. It's really, we have the option of use glucose or use fat. But when glucose is around, we use that preferentially because that insulin's around saying, don't use fat. So you can imagine you get into this situation where you've been eating a lot of carbs, which is normal in the American diet. The vast majority of our calories come from refined carbohydrates these days. You're getting all these glucose spikes. You're getting all these insulin spikes. You start generating that insulin resistance. The body's then pumping out more insulin to try and overcome that. Now you've got high insulin levels at baseline. And what are you not going to do in that situation? Burn really any fat. So it's just this really interesting cycle that ultimately gets us really dependent in these high insulin states, getting dependent on burning carbohydrates for fuel. And we kind of become these like metabolic carb addicts, but we're not even doing a good job of it because we become insulin resistant. So it's just this really fascinating cycle. And this is why focusing on our blood sugar levels and making sure that we're keeping our blood sugar levels more stable over time, and therefore ideally keeping our insulin levels more stable over time, means that we stay sensitive to the signal. And when we do have carbs in the body, we're able to process them, convert them to energy, move it through the system. And when we don't have a lot of glucose around, our insulin levels are nice and low and we can tap into fat burning for energy. And that's that beautiful state of metabolic flexibility, but it requires that we don't overload the system day in and day out with these dietary carbohydrates that ultimately will make us insulin resistant. So that's kind of the big picture around those things, and why there's just a lot of value to zeroing in more on understanding how our food is affecting our blood sugar levels.
Absolutely. And I want to talk about, I'm going to just shelf that just for a minute because I definitely want to get into how food specifically, and I can share a little bit about what I've learned from wearing CGM. But before we get there, I think it's interesting to define some goalposts for us, meaning that, if we were to think about if we were to look over a 24-hour period, is there, a mean fasting 24-hour glucose that we might look to hit or to get within reach? Or is there, a daily or a range, like a postprandial, or after you eat something, is there a postprandial range, ideal range that you'd like to? Is it 140 milligrams per deciliter or less, or and there's a lot of sort of delineation around HbA1c levels and fasting glucose levels and postprandial levels being 100, at the 2 hour mark being under 140 milligrams per deciliter. Is that, in terms of your research and in terms of the data that you've accrued at levels, are there ranges that you like to see over a 24? Is there a mean 24-hour level of glucose, fasting glucose, that you like to see in a range?
Mm. Yeah, it's such a great question. And the reality is that there's unfortunately not standardized ranges that have been put forth by the governing bodies at these. So like the American Diabetic Association or the International Diabetes Federation, IDF. And the reason for that is twofold. One is that we haven't had access to continuous glucose monitors for very long. And so there hasn't been as much research really characterizing these 24-hour trends. And secondly, unfortunately, we don't do a really good job of studying healthy people in our biomedical research often because, again, it's this bias towards focusing really only on when disease emerges and less on understanding like how to keep people healthy. And so there's very few studies of basically healthy individuals wearing continuous glucose monitors and understanding their blood levels, but there are about 6 or 7 that have done that. And so I can speak to those. So that's where they've taken healthy populations, put CGMs on them, and just kind of looked at what happens with their glucose levels. And what you find is that really for about 90 to 95% of a 24-hour period, people are staying within a range of about 70 to 120 milligrams per deciliter of glucose. Some of the studies that have slightly less healthy or older populations show that it's more between 70 and 140. But the main takeaway is that it's very unusual if you are a non-diabetic individual to go outside of that 70 to 120 or 70 to 140 range, depending on the study. That is, an interesting thing to know because it's actually different than what we would expect from some of the more standardized diagnostic criteria. So one of the standardized ways to determine whether you're non-diabetic, pre-diabetic, or diabetic is an oral glucose tolerance test. And that's where you're basically asked to chug 75 grams of this glucose drink, which is like the grossest thing. It's this horrible orange drink. And then they measure your glucose at basically an hour, 2 hours, sometimes 3 hours, and look what happens to your glucose. And basically, if your glucose is going to go up, obviously, but if you're below 140 milligrams per deciliter at 2 hours, you're considered non-diabetic. And I would say that's like a pretty lenient test because based on this other research in non-diabetic individuals, we should probably never be going above 140. So to be just under 140 at 2 hours, that means you've been elevated above that for 2 hours. So I think we probably need to be looking at like narrower and tighter ranges to really understand true metabolic health, not just absence of disease. So when you also look at these studies, they are looking at 24-hour average glucose levels. And in these studies, they range from about 99 to like 105 and there's a great blog post I've written on the Levels blog that summarizes a lot of this data, but 24-hour average glucose levels in healthy people tend to be around 99 to 105 in these studies. And then if you look at research on optimal fasting glucose levels, so that's your levels first thing in the morning after not having eaten for about 8 hours. If we just look at the standard criteria, under 100 is considered normal, non-diabetic. You wake up, your blood sugar is under 100, you're considered to be not pre-diabetic, not diabetic, healthy. But if you really look deeply in the research, it actually seems like a value between 72 and 85 is a lot better for health than if you're in the upper range, like 85 to 100, which is still considered normal by standard criteria. But if we're looking at like future outcomes like heart disease or even developing diabetes or obesity or things like that, a low normal, so 72 to 85 seems to be quite a bit healthier. So long story short, if you're wearing a CGM, probably shooting to stay the vast majority of the time between 70 and 120, shooting for an average kind of around 100. I think probably it could be tighter than that. My average tends to be around 88 or so throughout the day. And then shooting for a morning glucose between about 72 and 85. And then after meals, I would recommend, and I know a number of the physicians on our advisory board, sort of agree with this based on their professional research and their research-based opinion, is not to really go above 20 to 30 points after a meal. So you eat your meal and then you're going to go up and come down. You don't really want that spike to be more than 30 milligrams per deciliter above your baseline. And when I'm really dialed in and cooking at home, I can easily get it to 10 to 15 as a spike. And that could be a really big, hearty meal. But if I'm really focusing on keeping the refined carbs down and all of that, I can get it to about 10 to 15. So those would kind of be the parameters I'd shoot for. Less than 30 after a meal. Staying under 120 most of the day, and a fasting glucose around 72 to 85.
Well said. And I think that you can really make this argument for many of the standard, you can look at someone's resting heart rate and they say, well, 60 to 100 beats per minute. And it's like, there's a 40% difference between someone who has a heart rate of 60 and someone who has a heart rate of 100. And to your point, someone who has a fasting glucose of, let's call 85 milligrams per deciliter in the morning versus someone who has 110 or 100, there's something going on there that we really want to be exploring. So I think that even when you're, looking at these sort of standard ranges, or I should say under 100, right? Because they say under 100 milligrams per deciliter, you're fine. But someone who has 85 versus someone who has 100,
very different.
It's very different. And
when you actually look at the curves, like the curves of risk, which are in a number of studies, it's almost, you start getting that exponential increase in risk for future disease well before you reach 100. And so you don't want to be on that upswing, you want to be at that bottom portion of the graph.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the distinction between the glycemic index of foods, because as people are hearing you, they're going to say, okay, so watermelon, that probably has a really, that's probably something that it's all sugar. So we want to talk about the difference between, glycemic index, glycemic load, glycemic variability. Can you separate these a little bit for us so we can understand them a little bit better as we're talking about some of the things that influence our glucose?
Absolutely. So these are such important terms to parse out, because basically we have the glycemic index is this scale that was created that kind of said, okay, what is going to happen to blood sugar when someone eats 50 grams of carbohydrates of a particular food? Watermelon, like you mentioned, like it's a sweet food, but to actually eat 50 grams of sugar of watermelon, you'd have to eat a lot of watermelon. That's like a big bowl.
It's a big meal.
Right. Exactly. So the glycemic index of that, if you truly ate 50 grams worth of carbohydrates of watermelon, yes, it would spike your glucose quite a bit. But the glycemic load of it is going to be not quite as much, because you're never going to eat that much of that. The key thing to sort of differentiate between the glycemic index and glycemic load and glycemic variability is the fact that glycemic variability is actually what's happening to your blood sugar in response to eating, in terms of how much your glucose is going up and down. So you can imagine just a graph of your glucose over 24 hours. It's going to go up after meals. It might go up in response to stress, and then it's going to come back down. That's your body, coming back into homeostasis after each of these triggers, whether it's food or stress or whatever. And that amount of up and down, whether it's big spikes and big valleys versus gentle rolling hills, that's glycemic variability. High glycemic variability are the big spikes and the big dips. Low glycemic variability is more the gentle rolling hills and or just like a flat glucose line. We want low glycemic variability. We know based on the research that is associated with better health. And as you get more along the metabolic dysfunction spectrum, so as we get more overweight and obese, as we move from normal to prediabetes to diabetes, we know that glycemic variability increases in relation to that. So it's really an amazing marker of where you are on the metabolic spectrum, how much glycemic variability you're displaying day to day. So it's kind of a two-way street. The more glycemic variability that we sort of generate in ourselves by what we're eating, the more we're going to drive these processes like insulin resistance that's going to lead to moving towards prediabetes and being overweight. But then additionally, when we get into those states, we're more likely to just have glycemic variability at baseline, meaning that when you're pre-diabetic or diabetic, you're going to respond in a more extreme way in terms of blood sugar rise to the same food that you might have eaten when you were non-diabetic. It's going to have a bigger spike. So it's kind of this two-way street, and unfortunately like a vicious cycle. So the beauty is that what we can do by testing our blood sugar with a continuous glucose monitor is have this granular sense of what's going on with our glycemic variability day to day, and then work to decrease it. Learn what choices we're making every day, whether it's walking after a meal or adding fat, protein, and fiber to a carb source, or not eating late at night. All of these things might decrease that overall spikiness of the 24-hour curve, and we reduce that glycemic variability. And that's basically positive. So I would argue that we really can totally move away from the glycemic index and glycemic load conversation into what is really becoming more of a personalized glycemic index, which is understanding your glycemic variability in response to food. And that's something we have the power to do now, which we never had the power to do before. And one just small final point is that the glycemic index chart makes the impression that everyone is going to respond the same way to 50 grams of a particular carbohydrate, that you and I could both eat 50 grams of carbs with carrots and have the exact same glucose response. But we actually know now that that's not true. Each person responds very differently to the exact same carb source. And a lot of this came out of an amazing research paper about 5 years ago out of a lab in Israel called the Weizmann Institute. And it was called Personalized Nutrition by Prediction of Glycemic Responses. And they took 800 people, all wearing a continuous glucose monitor, gave them the same meals, standardized meals. And based on that glycemic index chart, you'd assume all their glucose, their blood glucose would rise the exact same amount, because that's what the chart says. There's an inherent property of the food in terms of how it raises glucose. That's not at all what happened. People were all across the board, from no spike to a huge spike to the same meal. And so this was, and some people actually responded in opposite ways. So you could give someone a cookie and a banana, and they might have a spike to the banana and no spike to the cookie. And person B has a spike to the cookie and no spike to the banana. It's like, this totally changes the way we would interpret a glycemic index chart. So really, we probably each need our own for ourselves. And some of the factors that went into those different responses were things like microbiome composition, how your bacteria in your body are actually processing the glucose, and that differs person to person. And so we're just entering this really fascinating realm of having the ability to do personalized nutrition. But I do think it's important now, because the biggest crisis we're facing in healthcare right now is metabolic dysfunction, is blood sugar dysregulation. Like we talked about before, this is affecting 9 of the 10 leading causes of death in the US, and 40% of Americans have prediabetes or diabetes. And again, 72% of the country is overweight or obese. So this is not just recreational at this point. Like, this is something that having awareness about this and thinking about it in our own bodies is certainly not like something that's kind of a biohacker hobby. This is something that we all need to be thinking about.
Absolutely. And I think, to your point around considering the microbiome, there's so many things that will influence the composition. You and I, so for example, I'll give you an example of, I used to, eat cashews, like pop them like candy, absolutely love them. Of course, had the CGM, and my body literally responded like I was having candy. Like my glucose went berserk, and I would have never known that. I would have never known that. I love, I still absolutely adore cashews, but now, I might have Brazil nuts instead. And that's actually what I have, because I have a much more reasonable response to having Brazil nuts than I do to cashews. And you would say, oh, they're just both nuts and whatever. But for whatever reason, the substrate. So you can, you're talking about this like glycemic index, like the substrate is going to be the same for all people, which I think is an oversight because we also have to consider, our hormones. You were talking about insulin. There's many hormones that would go into under the category of hormones. Our enzymatic degradation, like how quickly the thing moves along. And then you said microbiome, which I think is also an incredibly useful, addition to that, to what might be the difference between me having cashews and you having cashews, for example, right?
Yeah, exactly. And not to mention that, I mean, then you can add the additional layer of complexity of, did I sleep well last night?
Right.
Like we know that if you have a poor night's sleep, you are going to be more insulin resistant the day after you've had a poor night of sleep compared to a night you've had good sleep. Like this insulin resistance concept that we've been talking about, just for the listeners, like it's not just something that happens like a progressive march over time. It also can sort of switch up acutely. If you exercise, you're acutely more insulin resistant. If you lose sleep, you're acutely more insulin resistant. If you're stressed, that can promote cortisol, which pushes glucose out into the bloodstream. So these other factors, like, are you eating cashews when you're sleep deprived, stressed, and
Right.
haven't worked out
Right.
versus well slept, worked out, and not stressed? It actually can be a profoundly different response. I found that piece to be really fascinating. So, and that's really what my company Levels builds, is that software layer that helps people put that all together, because it's not, unfortunately, it'd be bit simpler if it were just about the food, but it's actually, there's other factors involved as well. And so in that sense, glucose becomes this really beautiful sort of centralizing force around a lot of the lifestyle factors I think a lot of us are working on: stress, sleep, exercise, food, etc., microbiome, and becomes something that's like the readout for a lot of those different inputs. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Well said. And I wish I had a CGM when I was studying for my boards, because like that's like the perfect storm of metabolic disease. It's like no sleep, you're stressed out of your mind. You're like, I have been in school for 4 years. If I do not pass this, like this is a big problem. So you're under crazy stress. And I was popping cashews like nobody's business, because that was like my quick little snack that I could have in between whatever. So
Yeah.
let's talk a little bit about some of the other. So we've been talking about these influences on glucose. One of the things that I've heard you talk about, and I innately learned this with my children, was the nutrient timing of things. So I used to, when it's time for my kids' meal, I would put like the chicken and I'd put the potatoes and I'd put the whatever, and then I would give them the food. And of course, my kids just ate the potatoes and then they filled up and they were like, we're full, mommy, we don't want any more food. So what I started doing was giving them their chicken first. And then once they finish the chicken, then if they're still hungry, then I give them, the carb piece. And I've heard you talk about this in the context of glucose regulation. I'd love for you to expand on nutrient intake and nutrient timing as something that can, positively or negatively affect your glucose response to your meal.
Definitely. And that's so fascinating about your kids. Like that tiny switch up probably had a really big impact on their response to the food. And this really gets down to this concept of food sequencing. So this has been well studied. Basically, if you eat the carbohydrate first in the meal, you're going to have a higher glucose response to that meal compared if you eat that carbohydrate last in the meal and actually front load with fat, protein, or vegetables. So those are some of the things that have been studied. There's actually one study where they gave people chicken and vegetables before a bread. I believe it was like a couple pieces of like focaccia bread or something. And then they switched it. They gave the bread and then the chicken and the vegetables, and had a completely different glucose response, much better when the chicken and the vegetables were given first. There's also been studies looking at like a handful of almonds before a meal, which is kind of like a fat and protein, and studies looking at eggs before a carbohydrate rich meal. All of them show the same thing. If you basically eat the bready pasta thing second and put these sort of blunting foods beforehand, it's better for your overall glycemic response. This could have a lot of different reasons why. It slows GI transit, kind of slows the absorption of the carbohydrates because you've got all this other roughage and fiber in the gut. Could be microbiome factors, could be hormonal factors. There's a number of reasons, but it's funny because if you walk into an Italian restaurant, you're getting the bread basket first. If you walk into a Mexican restaurant, you're getting the tortilla chips first. It's the opposite of what we should be doing. So, definitely if you want them, ask them to be brought after the salad course or something like that.
Or
So,
guac. Ask for the
or
guac.
guac
Ask for the
and
guac.
vegetables.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that would honestly be the perfect thing to do, is get guac and some veggies and have that first. The second piece, aside from food sequencing, is food timing. So we tend to be more insulin sensitive earlier in the day and less insulin sensitive later in the day. So we probably want to front load our higher carbohydrate foods to earlier in the day when we can process them and take them up and produce less insulin in response to them. I mean, ultimately, hopefully this point has been made. We want to keep our insulin levels sort of down and more stable to kind of generate that metabolic flexibility, potentially generate that fat burning for weight loss that we want. So you can kind of get more bang for your buck by eating the carbohydrates earlier in the day, when we're going to have to produce like sort of less insulin and have less of this, overcoming the relative insulin resistance of night. So I tend to eat really more of my carbohydrates earlier in the day, and then taper almost to sort of keto by end of the day, where my dinner is almost like a very little, low carb meal, probably like below 10 net carbs or something like that, to just really kind of let my body settle before bed. And because I know that I'm just going to essentially be paying more for it if I eat it later at night. And there's been actually studies on this too, where they give people standardized meals morning and night and see a totally different glucose response. And this kind of gets into the concept of why intermittent fasting and time restricted feeding can be very effective for some people for their metabolic or weight loss goals, because ultimately, what is time restricted feeding? It's putting your feeding window into a shorter period of time, usually earlier in the day, stopping eating, 3 or 4 hours before bed potentially. And what that's doing is it's giving your body essentially an insulin rest. It's saying, like, we're not putting exogenous carbohydrates or protein, which can also stimulate insulin, into the body. Your body just doesn't need to produce this insulin for a longer period of time. We can move through the glucose in the body and then flip that switch into fat burning. And that sort of forces your body to become more metabolically flexible, because you've kept the insulin down for a longer period of time. And one piece of research that I loved was they took two groups of people and gave them the exact same number of calories in 24 hours. So no changes in the calories or food, same meals. One group ate between 8 a.m. and 2 p.m. One group ate the same amount of calories between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. So it was a 6-hour feeding window or a 12-hour feeding window, one that ended a lot earlier in the day. And of course, despite eating the same amount in each group, the 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. window had much better metabolic parameters, 24-hour glucose levels, insulin levels, et cetera. So eating the same amount, no dieting, just changing the timing of the food to a shorter window, giving their body such a longer break of lower insulin. So I think there's a lot of easy tweaks we can do to just kind of get a better bang for our buck when we're eating the foods we enjoy.
And this goes so much further and beyond. Like, this goes such a beautiful level, deeper than calories in, calories out. Because we hear this ad nauseum, I think at this point. We are talking about, in order to lose weight or in order to improve things, we're often told calories in versus calories out. And I think that when we now start to pay attention to timing, and I used to practice more of I would start eating at noon, and then I might finish eating at 7 or 8. And I found just naturally, I actually prefer, I started working out in the morning. So, tended to have like a post-workout meal. So I've naturally just shifted my food intake earlier in the day. So I always joke, like, I eat like my grandmother. Like, I start eating at like 10, and then I finish eating at about 4. Like, I finish 4 or 5 o'clock, and I'm fine. I sleep really well. And so it's an interesting concept for people, because we're so often, especially when fasting really started gaining in popularity, and maybe this is maybe 2 levels deep around, sexual dimorphisms. But what I would often notice was people in the online space were men talking about, well, I fast until noon, and then I'll, eat until 12 to 8. And, that's my 8-hour eating window. And I remember, I was like, I can do that, like strong like bull. I'm going to do the same thing, like I'm going to do the same kind of fasting thing, but it didn't really work for me. I was starving by the time I got to 12. I felt like a limp plant that hadn't been watered. So, Yeah, just an
Very
interesting thought to throw out at you.
definitely. I'm very excited about a book that's coming out in September. Dr. Sarah Gottfried, who wrote like Hormone Cure, Hormone Reset Diet. It's called Women, Food, and Hormones. And it
Mm.
talks exactly about what you're talking about, which is the sexual dimorphism. Why might it work for men, but not for women? And I think a lot of it comes down to hormones and how the timing and the stressor that the body is signaled by, too much fasting or whatnot, how that can change our hormones. And so, yeah, really, really looking forward to it. I think it's going to break down why keto works for some, like for men a lot of the time, but might not work for women in the same way. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yes. Amazing. So let's talk a little bit about stress. Because I think, we've been talking about how some foods, like the nutrient timing and the composition of the diet, the way that we're, eating our foods can impact glucose. I think that when we talk about stress, I think a lot of people think, oh, stress is this, thing where, you're red in the face and you're screaming and you're like, I can't take it anymore. But I think that stress is much more subtle and much more nuanced. If I saw you on the street and I say, hey, Casey, how are you doing? Your life could be unraveling like a ball of yarn. And you might say, I'm fine. How are you? Right. So, and I've noticed again, with just bringing this back to CGM, there's been times where like I've been podcasting, for example, and I'll look at my glucose after the podcast and I can tell when there was, I was asked a difficult question, like I can literally see a glucose spike in that, like, oh my God, they're asking like this really difficult question. This is going to take me like 10 minutes to break down or, whatever it is. Right. So let's talk a little bit about the influence of stress and how that impacts our glucose as well.
Yeah. So stress it's so funny because it's sort of the body's best intentions for us to help us in a time of stress by raising our glucose. But in our modern world, that potentially adaptive response has totally gone awry. So it's like the body had really good intentions. It's not working for us anymore. So what I mean by that is that when we're stressed, we release stress hormones, catecholamine hormones, cortisol, et cetera. And those go to the liver and tell our liver, oh my gosh, there's a stressful thing. We're probably going to need to mobilize. This is a threat. We're probably going to need to run. We're going to fight. We need energy and we need it now. And so it tells the liver to actually dump our stored glucose. It's stored in chains of glucose in the liver called glycogen, break it down, put it into the bloodstream, feed the muscles, feed the brain, get all this energy out there. So that would be great if we were being chased by a lion. It would be great if we were truly running away from something that was a threat. But those are no longer the threats we're facing in our modern world. We don't really have corporeal threats. Our threats are psychological, they're constant, and they're low grade. And the body has no idea that that's different than being chased by a lion. So we're still releasing the cortisol, we're still releasing the catecholamine hormones, even if it's a text message or an email or a podcast conversation or someone honking. Our body thinks we need fuel to run from that, and we don't. So what ends up happening? We end up sitting there with higher blood sugar levels than we need and no sink for it. We're not actually going to be using the muscles to pull that glucose out of the bloodstream. So it kind of sits there and causes problems, causes our insulin to go up. It's just maladaptive at this point. So it's really a function of our stressors changing over time. And so this response no longer being useful and now being damaging for us. So yeah, I mean, I think one of the most fascinating things about wearing a continuous glucose monitor for the last 2 years has been exactly what you talked about with like the podcasting. I can see when I'm giving a talk or something like that, my glucose literally goes up the minute the talk or maybe actually a few minutes beforehand, because you're nervous, and then will go up just like a food related curve and come down. And what I've learned, and now that I wear also heart rate variability monitors, so heart rate variability is a measure, sort of an objective measure of stress. And the lower the heart rate variability is, the more sort of a sign of a stress in the body. The higher it is, sort of the better the adaptive stress response. I find that HRV correlates with the glucose. So as the glucose goes up during stress, my HRV is dropping, and vice versa. So what that's meant to me is that I have to, whether I subjectively perceive that stress or not, the interesting thing is sometimes I'll be doing a talk or a podcast or something, the glucose will go up, but I actually didn't feel stressed. I felt okay, but my body knew I was stressed, which I think is fascinating. And my HRV knew I was stressed. So to me, it's becoming this like way of me tuning into my body more and saying, doesn't really care how I feel. I need to do my deep diaphragmatic breath right now. I need to stimulate my vagus nerve to counteract that cortisol and tell my body that there's not a threat, no matter how I feel. And it makes a difference. And there's been research on breath work and glucose control with positive associations between breath work and glucose. And it's not surprising based on the physiology. So I think there's really neat opportunities to use what could seem like really mostly a personalized nutrition tool, a continuous glucose monitor, to actually be a mindfulness biofeedback tool. Like it's strange, but it makes sense based on what's happening in the body.
I completely agree with you. And I do my 2x breath. It's like, I exhale twice as long as I inhale afterwards, or I do a little bit of yoga nidra, or, something to bring my parasympathetic activity up so that I'm kind of bringing down that catecholamine and that sympathetic cascade that you were referring to. So and I love that there's been research looking at breath work and its influence on glucose. I wasn't aware of those. That's incredible.
I'll share some of those links with you for the notes. But it's fascinating. And I highly recommend that people actually implement this before their meals too. Like taking a couple of those 2x breaths, whatever you want to do, box breathing, alternate nasal breathing, any deep breathing that's really stimulating the diaphragm. Do 5 before each meal, because I think one of the big problems we're seeing just nutritionally in our country is that we're eating on the go so much and we're not stopping, and we're starting our meals in a sympathetic nervous system, activated state. And so unfortunately that totally changes the way we digest food. It messes with our GI motility. It tells our microbiome, literally our thoughts can change the way our microbiome act. And so if we can just take a couple deep breaths before meals, this has not been studied, but I believe that that probably would change postprandial glucose responses if we could just like really get into that parasympathetic state before we take our first bite.
That's great. I love that. And let's touch on resistance training, and then I want to move into a couple of questions that I have for you on insulin.
Yeah.
One of the, I often train fasted. So I will often maybe have a cup of espresso or something before, just to kind of get the engine going. But one of the things that I have found, and, intellectually, why it's happening, but I'm just so in awe with the capacity of the body. But I'll be doing, a relatively intense, I like to lift heavy weights. I like to do my aggressive work typically in the morning, usually to coincide with my cortisol. So I like to do resistance training in the morning. And what I've noticed when I am wearing CGM is that my glucose goes up. And the first couple of times I noticed that, I was like, gosh, that's so funny. And then you're like, oh my gosh, of course, there's gluconeogenesis. You're lifting heavy weights. You're activating these, it's a circuit you're doing, I'm activating type 2 muscle fibers. And there's like there's an aerobic component to it. Of course, I'm going to need more glucose. But and maybe you can expand on this maybe more intellectually than I'm scrambling around for words, but I'm so in awe that the body knows what to do. Like, I'm at a loss for words sometimes. Like, I fumble to find the absolute intelligence that my liver knows right now that I need glucose. Like, I know that sounds really dumb, but that's just how I feel.
It's so beautiful.
Yeah.
It's so beautiful. And I think that awe, I'm with you 100%. I just like truly can't believe that the body knows how to do all this stuff all the time. And like, also that it's always trying to help us, just like with the stress glucose response, like it's trying to help us. And unfortunately, we're kind of not doing it any favors by like constantly letting ourselves be stressed all the time with the pings and the dings and the honks and the low, all this stuff. So it's such an appreciation for what the body's trying to do. Even insulin resistance is the body trying to help us.
Right.
It's trying to say, no, there's too much. We can't fill the cells anymore. Like, we need to block it. So I think when we think about the body, the way exactly how you're talking, with that awe and reverence, how can we work with it? How can we actually, this is what it comes down to, choices. How can we give the body the conditions it needs to just be functioning properly? And that's where our choices come in. So I'm with you 100%. But with the exercise piece, that physiology is so interesting. What you talked about with gluconeogenesis, creating new glucose from other substrates like protein. But also it's interesting, That's the same stress response when you're lifting really heavy weights or when you're doing high intensity interval training. So like above about 80% of your VO2 max or max heart rate, that is also a stress signal to the body. And the same thing is happening with the stress response, cortisol, liver, dumping glucose. The difference is that in this situation, your muscles actually need the glucose. And the beautiful thing about muscle, it's one of the only organs in the body that doesn't need insulin to take up glucose. Muscle contraction in its own right takes up glucose independent of insulin. So you are stimulating insulin from the liver and then sucking it up into the muscles to be actually processed. That's a positive cycle. That's actually good for metabolic health. That's good for insulin sensitivity over time. And you're kind of clearing the liver tank. You're clearing this like short-term storage bank of energy, which as you deplete that, your body's forced to then ultimately get into fat burning. Because once you run out of that quick storage of energy in the liver, we have a couple hours of stored glucose in the liver. When you're using that in your super intense workout, we lower that tank, which means we're having to flip the switch into burning fat. That's metabolic flexibility. And because you're doing this workout fasted, it means your insulin's low, which means that we actually can switch into fat burning. So it's this beautiful opportunity. And I think that's why fasted workouts are getting more attention, is because it's exactly what we're talking about. You're having to deplete the tank of stored glucose, switch into fat burning. And so therefore you're not only getting physical fitness, but you're also getting metabolic fitness and metabolic flexibility. So basically the take home with exercise and metabolic health is that contract your muscles as much as possible throughout the day, whatever that means to you. If it's walking 2 minutes every hour, if it's doing a resistance training where you're really lifting heavy things, if it's a jog, if it's any movement of the body is contracting muscles, and that becomes a glucose sink. What we know that resistance training is phenomenal for metabolic health because you're actually creating more muscle to be a glucose sink. It's like then at baseline, as you're just sitting, there's more muscle to burn through glucose. So that's really good. But if that's not something that people are interested in doing, I think it's worth mentioning that even like I said earlier, walking 2 minutes every hour can be valuable for metabolic health. And there was a study that was done where they took different groups of people, and it was 3 groups, and each group did a cumulative 60 minutes of walking per day. One group, it was 3 20-minute chunks before meals. One group, it was 3 20-minute chunks after meals. And then the other groups were 2 minutes every 30 minutes throughout the waking day. And the group that actually did best in terms of glucose levels over the course of the day was the 2 minutes walking every 30 minutes, even though all 3 groups watched 60 minutes. And I think the reason for that is because you're just more consistently throughout the day moving these large muscle groups. So it can be as simple as moving more frequently. I'm not at my standing desk right now, but it's been an hour, in 6 minutes, I haven't stood up. And that's, that's ideally, and if I were really dialed in, I would set my timer for every 30 minutes and just walk for 2 minutes around the house. And that's enough to have a meaningful difference. So
yeah, those little movement snacks, right? So instead of going to the fridge, right, for a snack, just like do a little lap around
I love that.
the house. I'm standing on my walking treadmill right now, but I'm not on it for the audio for the
You're
podcast. But
amazing.
yeah, I love the walking treadmill as well. So let's move into insulin a little bit, because we've been talking a lot about the glucose response, how food changes it, sleep, resistance training, stress. And I think it's worthwhile and we were talking a little bit about this in the pre-chat in terms of the relationship between glucose and insulin. So first, is there a diurnal pattern? So you've sort of alluded to this already, but is there a diurnal rhythm to insulin? So in other words, are there times of the day where we are more or less insulin, or more insulin sensitive, or more insulin insensitive?
Yeah. So we tend to be more insulin sensitive towards the later parts of the day more insulin resistant towards the end of the day. And part of this may actually have to do with the hormone melatonin, which is released from our pineal gland to help us get ready for sleep. So melatonin is released as the sun goes down and, helps prepare us for being tired. That may have an impact. The mechanisms aren't fully established, but may have an impact on pancreatic insulin release or insulin sensitivity in the body more broadly. But what we know is that, again, it's going to result in probably having a higher response to carbohydrates later at night. And so that's something to definitely keep in mind. And it's different between different people. I've seen people who wear a CGM and don't notice that carbs at night have a bigger impact on them. But for me, it's 100% the case. If I eat popcorn at 9 p.m. versus 10 a.m., it's going to be a very different thing. And it's going to screw up my sleep because I'm going to be bouncing up and down throughout the night. And also because you're a little bit more insulin resistant at night, when you eat those carbs, they're going to stick around for longer in the bloodstream overnight. And you may have a bit more of that glycemic variability overnight as you kind of absorb it and bounce around. And that can be disruptive to sleep. We know that bounces like that, ups and downs, can cause arousal at night. We want to keep glucose more stable if we can overnight. So not just for glucose control, but also for sleep. It's kind of important to, not be eating right around bedtime.
Right. And we know that when we have a CGM, so when we have this continuous glucose monitor, we can measure our fasted glucose. We can understand what our mean glucose level is, the range pre and postprandial, but it doesn't necessarily tell us our insulin levels, right? So, I told you in the pre-chat I wanted to ask you this, and I think that this would be a great time to kind of expand on it. But is there a way? The way that I sort of thought about this is, algorithmically, is there a way for us to estimate, average insulin in someone who's non-diabetic by looking over the course of the day at their glucose data points? Is that something that we can, the technology algorithmically is in the works, or is that something that we can look forward to so that we can pair the glucose with the insulin?
Yeah, so this is really going to be ultimately, I think, the holy grail of the next phases of metabolic tracking. We can't right now, unfortunately, say plug in your continuous glucose curve and say this is probably what your insulin is. We can give you you can sort of have a trend of what that might look like. And a lot of this research has come out of Stanford, Michael Schneider's lab, amazing work. He had a paper a couple of years ago called about glucotypes, patterns of glycemic variability. He took all these glucose curves, CGM curves from non-diabetic and pre-diabetic people, and I believe people who also had diabetes, and then looked at how does that curve trend with insulin levels. And they did find a relationship between the more variability, from low variability to moderate to high variability people in their glucose, had a relationship with increased insulin levels. So that's kind of a general proxy. Like the more spikiness that you have, the more your insulin levels are likely to be higher. And that kind of makes sense from a lot of the stuff we've talked about. But it's not a one-to-one relationship where you can just plug it in and say, this is what your insulin levels is. And part of that is because this fascinating thing about insulin, which is that, as the insulin resistance process happens, where your cells are seeing too much glucose, they're trying to block that glucose from flowing in, so they become insulin resistant. The body, the pancreas, produces more insulin to help drive that glucose in, like we talked about earlier. And that's when insulin is rising to overcompensate for the insulin resistance. That phase can make your glucose look normal, or it can compensate effectively for years and years before you actually start seeing glucose rise in the blood. So you're just like, this pancreas is working so hard to basically get that glucose into the cells. And that's this window that we're missing in modern American healthcare because we're not testing insulin levels. And research has shown that we are probably having this hyperinsulinemia, this insulin resistance, 13 years before our lab tests actually show a problem with glucose, like a fasting glucose change or an oral glucose tolerance test change. We're just totally missing that window. And that's where I think continuous glucose monitoring could emerge as a really cool tool to start predicting these patterns. Like, oh, my fasting glucose is still okay. It's still 85. But I have a lot of variability. So maybe I'm kind of moving along that spectrum, but my standard lab tests and the doctor aren't showing me. So it can be maybe a clue towards stuff starting to happen. And then ideally pairing that with a fasting insulin test could really give you more granular insight into where you stand on that metabolic spectrum. And just to make it really concrete for people, in case that like lost anyone, Dr. Stephanie and I could both have a fasting glucose of 85 milligrams per deciliter. And so based on what the doctor sees, they'd say you guys are equally metabolically healthy, but could be completely false. I could be keeping my glucose at 85 by having a fasting insulin of 30, and she could be doing it with an insulin of 2. So she would be much more metabolically healthy than me because her body's not having to, that's just saying that she's not overcompensating. Her pancreas is not dealing with insulin resistance and having to over pump out that insulin. So you kind of have to put these tests together to get a better picture. But I do think that the more we research CGM variability patterns, how that relates to insulin levels, it may be able to be used as sort of this predictive marker as well. But long story short, the tests we're using now, like just fasting glucose, are not enough information, and they're not catching people early enough.
So if you had, if it was unicorn sparkles and rainbows and you had all of the biomarkers that you could with this one probe,
Hmm.
we've talked about what glucose, the predictive value of glucose when we look at the glycemic variability and what that might mean for, different, cardio metabolic issues. We've talked about Alzheimer's and cognitive dementia, all of that. But what would be your ideal, if you could, stick a probe in and get a readout, what would be your ideal future of what CGM, the current technology can do, and in addition to some of the things you'd like to see?
Yeah, such a good question. And really, I'd frame this as I'd want to understand what are the biomarkers that tell me about cellular dysfunction that underlies most disease. And the diseases that we're facing right now, it's not actually really diabetes, obesity, heart disease, Alzheimer's. Those are names for symptoms, but it's not actually talking about the cellular dysfunction that's happening that's leading to those problems. That cellular dysfunction, those are things like inflammation, oxidative stress, insulin resistance, glycation, these subcellular pathologies that actually lead to all these upstream diseases. So I don't really want biomarkers about the diseases. I want biomarkers about the cellular physiology. So that's the framework that I'd use to understand this ideal probe that we're talking about. So from that lens, like, let's just work through them. I would want to really understand like food and how that's driving physiology. So that would definitely be glucose. That is a huge step forward in terms of understanding how nutrition is affecting our body. But I'd also want to understand, like, glucose is not the end all be all for telling us about how nutrition is affecting us. It's very, very helpful. But as an example, you could eat straight fructose. And that actually is not going to stimulate glucose levels to rise in the blood, but it has a lot of other problems. It can directly cause our liver to essentially turn sugar to fat, and that can make us insulin resistant. It's insulin resistant, even though it's not glucose. So I'd want something to monitor fructose. And a biomarker for that would be something like uric acid. That's a byproduct of fructose metabolism. So, okay, got my sensor. We've got it's measuring glucose. I'd also want it to be measuring uric acid. Other markers of liver function, since the liver is really the heart of our metabolism in the body, things like monitoring liver function day to day would be important to me. Because again, another example like the fructose, if I were to drink straight vodka all day, my glucose would not rise, but I know I'd be causing horrible damage to my liver and my body. So having something to track sort of day-to-day liver function, that would be another one. And there's a lot more we could unpack with nutrition, but basically, how do we create more granular insight about how what we're putting in our mouth is affecting our body? Glucose, huge part of that puzzle, but there are other biomarkers we want to look at. Then let's think about inflammation. I would certainly want some sort of continuous inflammation monitor to understand how food and lifestyle factors are affecting my acute inflammation over time. Oxidative stress, another key sort of cellular pathology that's leading to disease. Having something to measure that, I think, would be important. So that's kind of how I would frame it. Like, how do we really know day to day how our choices are affecting our cellular biology so that we can make better choices? That's what I'd want that ideal future sensor to show.
Yeah, I love that. And to your point, if there was a way, like, I think, okay, so a lot of patients that I've cared for over the years, they might present with more chronic burnout, chronic fatigue type syndromes. And when you really get down to that, it's like it's an insufficiency in the mitochondria, right? There's this purinergic signaling where the mitochondria, this sort of cellular defense process. And I wonder if there's, I'm sure there is, but or maybe the technology isn't there yet. But I'd love to be able to monitor mitochondrial health for everything that you just said, the oxidative stress, the systemic inflammation, and to be able to understand, when the mitochondria are shutting down. Because as you said, like the glucose, that is the substrate that creates the energy. And in an aerobic capacity, it's done in the mitochondria. It's done in that electron transport chain. But if your mitochondria are like, we are under attack, we got to shut this puppy down, your ATP production is going to be in the pisser. So
Right.
I wonder if there's, down the line, like to add to that sort of wish list, that unicorn sparkles and the
Right.
rainbows list is like pure
Something
energetic
about,
surgery. Yeah.
yeah, by like mitochondrial biogenesis or something like
Right.
that. I mean, certainly even understanding, proxies for mitochondrial health, like if we can measure ketones, which is a product of fat burning, plus glucose, plus oxidative stress, like we can kind of get a gestalt about what's happening with the mitochondria.
Yeah.
But potentially like further biomarkers down the road that can really help us understand like what's our capacity right now to make new mitochondria? Are we making more? Are we, how are they working? I mean, that's the future. And I think it's a very real possibility that these things are going to continue to emerge to give us this real-time feedback. And it's an exciting time to be alive with all this stuff.
It really is. Yeah. So tell people where they can find information about Levels if they're interested in CGM. And I'd also like you to plug your Instagram because it's so lovely to see how much great stuff you cook. You're such an inspiration to me. I'm like, oh, I think I'm going to try those kale chips that she made. Like, I like that. It looks like, so tell a little bit about, where people can find you and then also talk about Levels as well.
Sure. Yeah. So people can find me on Instagram at Dr. Casey's Kitchen. So Dr. Casey's Kitchen. And I do love to cook and I'm mostly plant-based. And so I really love experimenting with like how plants can really optimize our metabolic health and how to be plant-based and not have glucose spikes. Really. That's like really one of my passions. While still eating like beautiful, whole, clean foods and whatnot. And then Levels is at Levels on Instagram and Twitter. And it's really fun to follow Levels because all our beta customers are doing these amazing experiments and you can really learn a lot about, I think, everything we've been talking about just through how people are implementing this in their daily lives. And then I definitely recommend levelshealth.com/blog, which is just a wealth of information about metabolic health and how it relates to just the average person who's trying whatever you might be interested, whether it's performance, athletics, weight loss, polycystic ovarian syndrome, whatever. We have an incredible body of research-based knowledge there. And a lot of the guests from your podcast have written articles on there, David Perlmutter and others. And so it's Ben Bickman. It's a great resource. And then if you want to sign up for the wait list to get access to the continuous glucose monitor through Levels, that's just at levelshealth.com. And then there's a wait list. And so we're moving through the wait list, but then you'll get access to our newsletter and be alerted when there's availability in the program.
Well, I just want to tell you, as we close off this conversation, what a pleasure it's been to chat with you. You know your stuff. It is so lovely for you to be able to talk about the studies and how it's integrating into your research and how this is, driving your decision-making. And it's just been a pleasure. So thank you so much for accepting my invite to come on. And this has just been lovely for me. I hope you've enjoyed it as well.
I've enjoyed it so much. Thank you so, so much for having me on this conversation. And it's just been such a thrill to connect with you. Thank you.
Dr. Stephen Gundry is the video that's coming up next for you. Just click right here. We're talking about the microbiome, energy, postbiotics, mitochondria, and how to get your energy back.
Continuous ketosis, 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year is really dumb.